Mr. Friedman, please have a seat. Please be seated. The record will show the presence of the jury, the defendant, and all counsel. Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the delay in starting today. Mr. Freeman, you are still under oath. Do you understand? Yes. Mr. Nurmi, you may continue.
Thank you, Your Honor. Mr. Freeman, good morning again.
Good morning.
Yesterday, when we ended our discussion, we were about ready to talk about the trip you made to Sedona and the Grand Canyon with Jodi and Travis. But before we do that, it's my understanding that you felt yesterday that you had given some dates that weren't quite accurate. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay. Let me go back through some of these time frames with you. So now that you've thought about it a little bit, when do you recall meeting Travis?
I met Travis 2 years prior to my mission, my mission was 04 to 06.
Okay. So the mission we talked about, you going to Canada, proselytizing, that sort of thing, that happened what years?
2004 to 2006.
Okay. And then, so prior to, you had known Travis for before the mission, I think yesterday you might have told us after, but that was before your mission, a couple years before, right?
Yes, I knew him both before and after. I met him through prepaid legal initially, and then once he moved to Arizona, we became better friends because all of my friends within prepaid legal lived with him, and we started to hang out more. So by the time I left, he came to my farewell and hung out with me the week, quite a bit of it before I left.
And you said left for your mission,
For
right?
my mission, yes.
Okay. And then we spoke a little bit yesterday about when you came back from your mission. Did you live with him, just to clarify, before you left on your mission or when you returned?
I lived with him when I returned, the early part of 2007.
Okay.
I do believe I was there 3 to 4 months before moving back home.
Okay. Now, as it relates to your mission work, we spoke about the proselytizing and the process someone goes through. And I neglected to ask in that regard if you have been either as a missionary or you're a lifelong member of the Mormon Church, is that
Yes,
correct? Okay. Have you been involved in a baptism at that church?
Yes, I have.
Okay. And this baptism, from what you told us yesterday, is my understanding that occurs after, if someone is a new member of the church, so to speak, that happens after the long process that you spoke about yesterday. Baptism's the final step in that, right?
Yes, at the end of, a lot of times they give up many habits, whether it's drinking or smoking, or there's changes that have gone into their life, and they've shown those changes by how they've chosen to live their life up to that point. and they have an interview with either a member of the bishopric or someone in the mission who says that they're worthy to be baptized, and then they're taken in and baptized.
Okay, so it's a matter of, like you said, giving up things. You have to prove, in some ways, prove it to the church that you're worthy. Is that fair to say?
Yes, you must justify by the way you walk and act in the world that you have changed.
Okay. And that's for anyone who's baptized, correct?
Anyone who's baptized.
Okay. And the ceremony itself, could you describe that for us?
Yes, usually they'll have a ceremony that goes with it, and there will be some talks, and either the missionaries or friends who have become friends with the person who will be baptized. They will usually have a short speech about baptism and what it symbolizes and what it means. And then they will have the actual ceremony, and then they will have another speech afterwards to talk about receiving the Holy Ghost and what it means to receive the Holy Ghost that they will receive the following Sunday. But the actual ceremony itself, they walk down into the water, and the person being baptized takes that person by their arm, and they hold them in the water, and it's above the waist, usually mid-stomach depth. And
Okay.
the person baptizing them raises their right arm to the square, pronounces a prayer, and immerses them in the water and rises them up again, symbolic of being buried in death and risen again with Christ in birth.
Okay. In terms of, and I don't know if I'm using the right verbiage here, but how would one be deemed qualified to baptize a person?
To be qualified to baptize a person, or to be able to baptize a person first, you have to be a member of the priesthood and hold the proper priesthood to be an elder in the church. You have to hold the proper priesthood to be able to baptize. And once you hold the proper priesthood, if you are a worthy holder, judged by the way that you live your life, then you are able to baptize.
Okay. Let's back up a little bit then. What is you mentioned a couple terms, priesthood holder and elder. Are they the same thing, or could you kind of maybe define both terms for us?
Okay. Within the church, there's two priesthoods. The lesser, called the Aaronic priesthood, and the greater, called the Melchizedek priesthood. And within the lesser, there are deacons, teachers, and priests. And then within the greater priesthood, there are elders and high priests. And so usually the Aaronic priesthood, unless you join the church later in life, is a youth priesthood from 12 to 18. And upon turning 18, if you're worthy, you're ordained an elder. And as an elder, you have the ability to baptize and to give the Holy Ghost as well.
Okay. Okay. To your knowledge, what position, if any, or I don't know, label, status, whatever word you want to put on it, what position would be attributed to Mr. Alexander?
Travis was an elder in the church.
Okay. And being an elder in the church, somebody would have to come with the idea that they were living in accordance with Mormon principles, correct?
Yes.
And including the vow of chastity, correct?
Yes.
Is that a yes?
Yes.
Okay. Were you present when Miss Arias was baptized?
I was not. She was baptized before I met her. Travis talked about it when we went over to visit her the first time I met her. He'd mentioned that he'd given her Book of Mormon and introduced her to the church.
Okay. At that point in time, did you have any reason to believe Mr. Alexander was not living up to the principles of your church?
No.
In terms of, before we go into the trip again, as much as you can speak to your knowledge, was Mr. Alexander's peer group largely made up of members of your church?
Yes, it was.
As it relates to this trip to the Grand Canyon, Sedona, there was one trip to both destinations, is that
Yes.
correct? Okay. We heard yesterday during the Havasupai trip, which was the same summer, correct?
Yes, it was.
Okay. That they were acting as a couple, and there was also an undercurrent of couplehood, but a little tension, I think, is what you described for us yesterday, correct?
Yes.
Okay. As it relates to their Mr. Alexander and Miss Arias acting as a couple, was that going on during the Grand Canyon Sedona trip?
During the Grand Canyon Sedona trip, I don't remember any tensions between them that I can recall.
I'm sorry, what was
I
that?
don't remember any tensions between them that I recall on that
Okay.
trip.
Do you recall behavior consistent with them being a couple?
For the most part, yes. The only thing I do recall was when we were to the contrary, was when we stopped in Sedona to eat that evening
Okay.
on our way back to Phoenix. We went to a small restaurant there that Travis had heard about that was good. And while there, he made a joking comment to the waitress about him and Jodi not dating, and in kind of a flirtatious manner.
Okay.
And I didn't know how to take it. I just smiled and moved on. It wasn't any of my business. But
Okay. And in a flirtatious manner towards the waitress, right?
yes.
Okay. And was Jodi sitting at the table at the time?
Yes.
Okay. What do you recall of her reaction? Not anything she said, but was she upset in any way that you could observe?
I couldn't tell that she was upset, but she seemed to feel uncomfortable or unsure how to take the comment.
Okay. Now this, I know they both occurred in the summer of 2007. This trip to the Grand Canyon, was it weeks later? Was it months later than the trip to Havasu Pie?
I don't recall exactly the difference. I know that it was still cool outside when we went to the Grand Canyon in Sedona because we were in jackets in Sedona. We went and saw they had a Buddhist shrine there that we went and saw, and we were all bundled up because it was cold.
Okay.
And I know that we went to Havasu Pie, I believe, in September. So
Okay. Do you remember the sleeping arrangements during this trip to the Grand Canyon?
from that trip, from what I recall, and I was trying to think about this actually last night as well, as I was home running through things. But I believe that trip we just did a day trip because I don't remember. I think we drove up really early to the Grand Canyon, hiked around, and then stopped in Sedona on our way back down.
Okay.
That's my recollection of that trip.
So I guess there would have been no need for
yeah, there was no
sleeping
need
arrangements.
for.
All right. As it relates to this particular trip, were you of the understanding that Travis was also dating Lisa Andrews?
No.
Okay. And on this trip, you say you noticed no tension between the two of them?
No, aside from the comment at dinner, no.
Okay. Was there a point in time where you became aware of Travis and Jodi no longer dating?
Yes. Once we had, and this was after I'd moved back out, and Travis had he'd made a lot more friends in the ward that was there. And he'd started to have UFC fight nights at his house, and everyone would come over and watch the fights. And I recall many times that I would go over to the fights, and Jodi was still in town, still lived in Arizona, but she wasn't there because in that group of friends, them and Jodi, that was kind of the two different groups of friends. Was Lisa and the group from the church that was there.
Okay.
And so I remember fight nights that I would go to, but Jodi wouldn't be there. And that was in part because those two groups didn't mix.
Okay. To your knowledge, then, at the same time, you talked about those two groups not mixing. Were you aware of Mr. Alexander still spending time with Jodi away from that group?
Yes, I was. At that time, it was during that time, and that was after both of those trips. So it was later in that fall and that winter. I hung out and spent time with Travis and with Jodi separately for the most part. I heard about them spending time together, but usually there was no one else. At least I wasn't there when they spent time together. And I would hang out with them separately. And so I knew that there was tension there because they would both talk to me about one another and what was going on to some extent. But they were, I hung out with them separate, but they weren't officially split up. When they officially split up, and I don't know how that conversation went.
Okay.
I just know that in talking to Travis, he had said that he was going to talk to Jodi, or they were going to have an official conversation. And then sometime after that, Jodi had moved back to California.
Okay. These times when Jodi and Mr. Alexander were spending time together, it sounds to me like from what you described, that was maybe just the two of them as opposed to in public settings. Is that accurate to your impression? Okay. And that was probably, to your impression anyway, was that something that a lot of people knew about, or just perhaps you and a select few?
I don't think a lot of people knew. I think there was more of a select few. Others may have known, but I know that Travis didn't talk about it a lot.
Okay. Did you know of Jodi and Travis traveling together, taking other trips together?
Yes, they went, there's 2 trips, I'm trying to think. One, I know they went on that one I think was a day trip. They went down to the balloon festival. And they had a lot of pictures that they took at that. It looked like they quite enjoyed it. And then they went on and I think it was around a convention that we went to, but they did a church history tour.
Okay.
And took 3 or 4 or 5 days and went and saw church history sites that I recall them talking about.
Okay. So a church history site tour, so to speak.
It was a road trip around the U.S. to the convention or to whatever was at the end of it and then back.
Okay. Since you brought up the church history trip, and we've talked a little bit about baptism and your work as a missionary, in your interaction with Jodi, did you ever have any concerns that her conversion to the Mormon faith was disingenuous or motivated solely by Travis?
Approach.
Back up a step and ask you this. You talked about how at a certain point in time that you began to hang out with Miss Arias without Travis.
Yes.
Okay. And I believe, if I follow the timeline correctly, this was at a point in time when you were living back at home.
Yes.
Okay. And Was that in Gilbert then, based on what you were telling us yesterday?
Yes, it was.
Okay. And who lived back at home with you at that point in time?
My parents, my brother, and one of my sisters was there.
Okay. Did Jodi also have a relationship with those other members of your family?
Yes, she did.
Okay. Close relationship?
Yes.
Okay.
She came by for, once she had moved to Arizona, she came by several times for dinner, for different things with the family, and she would help. My foster sister arrived there in the meantime while Jodi was there. We adopted a foster sister who was close to 18, and she had a photography class, and Jodi would help her with her photography homework. And when my sister Desiree and I would hang out and do other things, Jodi would come, and a lot of times it would just be the three of us, or work on vision boards, or do many different things that we would do.
Okay. We heard your sister's also a member of the Mormon
Yes.
Church, correct?
Yes, she is.
Are your parents also so inclined?
Yes, they are.
Okay. Were there, in the times of these interactions, or even the interactions you had with yourself, did you discuss the Mormon faith or church or spiritual issues with Jodi?
Yes.
Okay. Several of those discussions?
A lot of the things we talked about had to do with spirituality or things that we were learning in general. The church specifically, I can think of several instances that we addressed her conversion, or we talked about how she joined the church, or things that were going on in her singles ward where she was at. But I mean, it wasn't a daily topic of discussion,
Right.
but we did discuss it.
But you did talk to her about her conversion, her spirituality, how that worked for her, I guess.
Yeah.
Based on those conversations, do you have any reason, in your experience, do you have any reason to believe that her conversion was less than genuine?
Objection, lack of foundation, wasn't there when she converted. Hearsay.
Overall, you may answer.
No, I do not have any reason to believe it was disingenuous.
Okay. It sounds like in this point in time, between breaking up with Travis and her moving back to California, that you and Jodi became closer. Is that correct?
Yes, between when they were separated but unsure of what they were doing.
Okay.
When Travis would hang out with kind of the other group of friends who I got along with more or less, we would invite, Desiree and I would invite Jodi over and hang out. And so we had a number of things that we did, but we became closer.
Okay. And she was close to your whole family?
Yes.
Okay. I have to ask, in case the issue is raised, did you ever have a romantic interest in Miss Arias?
No, I did not.
Okay. How do you view her?
She became a sister
Okay.
in our family.
After Jodi moved to California, did you remain in contact with her?
We would talk on occasion if she came into town. And sometimes I'd find out she was in town after she arrived in town, but
Okay.
she would call and we would meet up or say hi, or she'd swing by the house and see the family for the most part. And then sometimes go hang out with Travis or stop by and see him. But she'd just come by the house and hang out.
Okay. Did you make contact with her after you found out that Mr. Alexander had passed?
Yes, I did.
Do you remember when that contact occurred?
Brent Hyatt, a friend, he was at Travis's house, and he had gone over there, and he had called me to tell me that they'd found Travis, and that somebody should probably call and tell Jodi. And since I knew her probably the best out of that group of friends from prepaid, he thought I should be the one to call and tell her.
Okay. And did you do that?
Yes, I did.
And I understand it was over the phone, but can you give us an assessment of her demeanor that you could discern over the phone when you advised her this information?
When I called, I was didn't know what to say, I guess you would say. Had no words really, and it took a minute. And I told her that Travis had been found dead, and the other end was silent for a moment, and I didn't know what to take of that, and just waited. And she after a moment, became emotional and started to cry on the phone. And I talked to her for a minute, but there wasn't anything I could think of to do to comfort someone over the phone. So, after probably 2 minutes, I let her go so she could be with herself.
Thank you, Mr. Freeman.
Cross-examination.
So with regard to this issue of spirituality and conversion and the baptism, you were asked questions about that, right?
Yes.
You weren't present at the time that she was baptized, right?
No, I was not.
So you don't know her motivations at the time that she was baptized, do you?
No, I do not.
And one of the things that you indicated to us was that when a person goes through this process, they give up certain things, right?
Many times, yes.
Well, one of the things they give up is sex, premarital sex, right?
Yes.
So, did you know that the defendant was having oral sex with Mr. Alexander at the time of her baptism?
I did not know that.
So if somebody was having oral sex at the time of their baptism, you would agree that that wouldn't be a sincere, if you will, baptism under your definition, right?
I would agree that they would not be ready to be baptized.
And also you said that you called her when Mr. Alexander was found, right?
Yes.
And that occurred on the night that he was found, right?
Yes.
You were called by this individual by the name of Hyatt, right?
Yes, I was.
And you ended up calling the defendant about 11 o'clock at night, didn't you?
That sounds correct.
And when you called her at 11 o'clock at night, it was via telephone, right?
Yes.
And when you called her on the telephone, you told her that Travis was gone, or words to that effect, right?
Yes.
And you said there was a moment of silence, right?
Yes.
And then that she began to, what, cry?
I don't know if you would call it babble, but to mumble, oh my goodness, and yes, to cry there, yeah.
And if you guys were pretty close though, right, back then?
Yes, she sounded disbelieving.
Right, but you were close is my point, right?
We were friends, yes.
And she would confide in you things back then, right?
Many things yes, some things no.
Well, she would confide at least some things to you, right?
Yes.
And did she confide to you at that time that she killed Travis?
No.
So if she didn't tell you that she killed him, that's a lie, isn't it?
Objection is argument.
Rephrase.
Did she tell you that she killed Travis?
No, she did not.
Did you cut her off at any time during that conversation such that you didn't let her tell you that? Is that how rude? You weren't rude in any way, were you?
No.
You did give her
I
that
didn't speak very much at all.
You gave her that opportunity, right?
Yes.
You also talked to defense counsel about a situation involving Mr. Alexander and his relationship with the defendant. Do you remember that? Specifically about Mr. Alexander having the talk with her, right?
Yes.
And you told us that it was Mr. Alexander who told you that he was going to have the talk with her about breaking up, right?
Objection calls for hearsay.
Overruled.
You told us that, right?
Yes, I had a conversation with Travis in which he said he was going to have a conversation with Jodi.
Right. And he was going to break up with her, right?
That he was going to officially separate, because they were more or less broken up in that they weren't dating, but they would still hang out on the weekend or whenever one of them was in town or the other.
And he was going to end even that part of the
Yes.
relationship, right?
Yes.
And it was after he told you that then she moved to California, right?
Yes.
The trip to Havasupai, it didn't start very well, did it?
No.
And in fact, you went over to Travis's house, right?
Yes.
And when you went over, you looked at a backpack that belonged to the defendant, right?
The backpack belonged to me, but it was full of her things.
And there were some things in it, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And you picked up that backpack, right?
Yes.
And when you picked up that backpack, you realized it was way too heavy, right?
Yes.
And so you went through the backpack and started taking things out, right?
Yes.
It wasn't Mr. Alexander that did that.
No.
And Mr. Alexander was standing there, though, right?
Yes.
And so was your sister, right?
I think so.
And as you're going through this, the purpose of taking all this stuff was that you were going to hike 13 miles, right?
Yes, it was to lighten the load.
Right, and if you're going to hike 13 miles, you really don't want to take a lot of weight, do you?
No,
And it wasn't that you were being mean or anything like that, right?
no,
It wasn't that you weren't doing it other than for a good reason, right?
yes,
And the reason was so that everybody, or at least the person who had to carry that backpack, would have a better time, right?
yes. And so Travis and I didn't have to split it up and carry it later too.
Right, right.
But yes,
And so when you took that stuff off, at some point the defendant came down from upstairs, right?
yes,
And she saw that all of those items were out there, right?
yes, they were sitting on the table.
She became upset, didn't she?
Yes.
She got upset at you, didn't she?
She was upset in general and
All
more
right.
frustrated. It didn't seem that she was upset at any one of us in particular.
So she wasn't upset at you, she wasn't upset at Travis, she was just upset.
Yes,
And she was upset because this stuff had been taken out, right?
Objection
Yeah.
calls for speculation.
Sustained.
Did you know of any reason other than the backpack, as you sit here, why the defendant would be upset as you characterize it?
Calls for speculation.
Overruled. You may answer yes or no.
Do I know of any? No.
And the items that you took out, they were makeup sort of items, weren't they?
Yes.
What else did you take out?
Makeup, lotion, hand sanitizer, hair things, things of that nature. They were probably 10, 15 pounds worth of different things.
And as she was standing there upset, generally, what happened after that, it escalated to the point where she went upstairs, right?
Yes. I don't remember what Travis said, but he made a comment partially and it was a sarcastic comment that he made. And after he made that comment, she said something back and then she became emotional and went upstairs and Travis went up after her.
But she did say something back, didn't she?
Yes, and
To
they
dem-
went
to
back and
dem-
forth for a minute.
To demonstrate that she was upset, right?
Yes,
So it wasn't like she just sat there and took it. She responded back, didn't she?
yes,
And then she went upstairs, right?
yes,
And then he went after her to try to take care of whatever was going on, didn't he?
Objection calls for speculation.
Sustained.
He went after her, right?
he did go upstairs after her.
And they were up there for some time, right?
It was probably 20 minutes before I went up, and I could hear them talking, but not what they were saying.
So they were up there for some time, right?
Yes,
And then you went up there, right?
yes,
And when you were up there, neither of them was happy, right?
no,
And this all started because you had gone into that backpack, right?
yes,
Travis hadn't gone into that backpack, right?
no,
Came back down pursuant to whatever it was that you said, right?
yes,
And then into the car you went off to the Havasupai, right?
yes,
And Travis was driving, right?
yes,
The defendant was sitting right next to him, right?
yes, she was.
And they were pretty quiet, weren't they?
Yes, they were silent.
He wasn't saying anything mean to her, was he?
No,
She wasn't saying anything mean to him, right?
no,
And at some point, whatever was in the air drifted off, right?
yes, it did.
There was a time when there was some picture taking. Was this done at the Grand Canyon?
We took pictures of Grand Canyon, Sedona, and at Havasupai as well.
And was this picture taking that was done, did there come a time when Travis was asked by the defendant to stop so that the defendant could take pictures?
While we were driving?
While you were driving?
That sounds familiar. If it was, I want to say from what I can remember, that if that did occur, it happened on our way to the Grand Canyon itself, just before we arrived there. Because I remember
So you remember it on the drive up to the Grand Canyon, right?
I remember there was a point somewhere that they did have a squawk, something to do with taking photos,
Right.
but I don't remember the specifics.
And you don't remember any particularly biting comments that Mr. Alexander may have made, right?
No.
And you don't remember any particularly biting comments that the defendant may have made, right?
No.
And when you got to have a supai, to get back to that trip, that was what, 3 nights? Is that what it was?
I think it was 4 nights, because I believe we had 3 nights in the canyon, or we had 2 or 3 full days in the canyon, if I recall, maybe 2.
All right, and everyone had their hammock, right?
Yes, we all had a hammock and a sleeping bag.
At one point during the days, you did notice that there was some tension again between the defendant and Mr. Alexander, right?
Yes, it was the first day when we went to go swimming in the first waterfall. I was walking by Travis initially, and we walked over towards the falls, and my sister and Jodi were talking behind us. And we started to walk, and we were talking, and at some point it switched, and Travis and Jodi were talking. My sister and I walked ahead.
Right, and you could tell that they were having some sort of argument or problem, right?
Yeah, we were far enough ahead we couldn't hear what they were saying, but I looked back, and clearly they were having a disagreement about something.
And you and your sister took off, right?
I just kind of waved and said, we'll be over there, and we went over and swam.
And after about an hour and a half, they joined you, right?
It was a substantial amount of time. We were done swimming by any stretch of the imagination by then.
All right. And when Mr. Alexander Mr. Alexander actually put the trip to have a supai together.
Yes, he did.
And when he would put these trips together, it's true that in this particular case, you really didn't have anybody to go with, and so that's why you invited your sister, right?
It was the same on both trips for Sedona and Grand Canyon. As I thought about people I wanted to invite, there wasn't anyone that I was dating at the time that I wanted to take, and my sister was safe for everyone, and that everyone in the whole group could be themselves. So yes.
Right. And after part of what was going on with regard to the defendant and Mr. Alexander is that part of the reason that you went along was that he didn't want to be alone with her, right?
Yes. He
didn't want to be alone with her, did he?
In a conversation that he had with me previously.
The answer is yes or no. He did not want to be alone. You were going along as a chaperone, right?
I don't know that I can say that he didn't want to be alone with her, but he liked that when I was there or when I and my sister were there, that they weren't as physical.
And you viewed your role as somewhat of a chaperone, right?
I didn't view my role that way.
Do you remember that we had a conversation about this many years ago? At your house? Do you remember that we talked about this?
Yes, I do.
And do you remember that this issue came up back then?
I do not, but I can say that I could see myself as a chaperone.
Okay. And it was because Mr. Alexander asked you to be there in that role,
Yes.
correct?
Yes.
How tall was Mr. Alexander, sir?
That's a good question. He was about to my shoulder, so 5'8".
Right.
I'm
And
not
you're
sure.
how tall?
6'2".
So he came up to about your shoulder, right?
Yeah.
And he wasn't an overly fat guy, was he?
No, he was fit. He worked out regularly, ran. When I lived with him, he was always working out and running, doing different things.
And how tall was the defendant back then?
I think she might be slightly taller than Mr. Alexander, but I'm not sure. I
I don't have anything else, thank you.
Redirect.
Thank you, Your Honor. Mr. Freeman, you were asked about this, what was characterized as you being a chaperone for this trip.
Yes.
In that regard, let me back up. How does your church view two individuals who aren't married, of the opposite sex, traveling alone together?
That depends on who you talk to.
Okay.
I don't think officially it's probably frowned upon, but traveling together is probably not frowned upon as long as you're not rooming together or staying in the same hotel room, things of that nature.
Okay.
But
if
I know it's not encouraged.
Okay, but if you were sleeping in the same room or same hotel room or whatever the accommodations might be, that would be problematic, right?
Yes, that would be discouraged.
And if you had two other people there with you, that would perhaps divert any suspicion or concerns in that regard, right?
Yes.
Okay. You also were asked, you said, well, because he didn't want to be alone with her. Were you in any, and he being Travis and her being Jodi, did she force her way onto this trip?
No.
We also talked about Mr. Alexander's fitness. You described him as being, I believe, to your shoulder, but you said he worked out regularly.
Yes.
Did you observe him work out? Is that when you lived together, or did you work out together?
When we lived together, he would get up and go running every day, and he had numerous exercises he would do regularly.
Okay. Strong guy?
Yeah.
Okay, you see him lift a lot of weights?
Yeah, he would lift weights.
Punching bag? Did he have that when you lived there, or did you recall?
I don't
him?
recall.
Okay. You ever see him strike anything?
Objection beyond scope.
Overruled.
Yes, but I'm trying to remember when. It was either a punching bag or it was something like a punching bag. I don't remember if it was a punching bag, but it was over the course as we would do the UFC fight nights.
Okay. Powerful punch?
Yes.
You were asked about Miss Arias's, whether or not she would be worthy of being baptized if she was performing oral sex upon Mr. Alexander, right?
Yes.
Okay. And your answer was that somebody wouldn't be worthy of being baptized if that was the case, correct? Yes. Okay. But when we spoke earlier, we also talked about how someone attains the position for which they have the ability, I think was your word, to baptize someone, right?
Yes.
Okay. And that person, a person who was receiving that oral sex, they wouldn't be worthy of that title, correct?
No, they would not be worthy to perform in the ordinances associated with that office at that time until they had gone through a repentance process.
And when we're talking about office, are we talking about when you said elder?
Elder, yes.
Okay. So, based on your experience in the church then, if someone in that position of an elder were to be violating the vow of chastity, they would lose their position in the church. Is that correct? Or they would lose that status?
They would not lose their status in that way. They would go to, if it is known that they are breaking the law of chastity within the church, especially with another member as well, they will go to a disciplinary council who will then determine what happens, whether they are excommunicated or their priesthood office is removed, or they go into a probationary period as for a year or for however long is dictated by the disciplinary council.
And what do you mean when you say probationary period? What does that mean?
If somebody goes into a probationary period, it's a term in their membership where they are not allowed to, they can come to the meetings and participate, but they're not allowed to partake of the sacrament, to give talks, to have a calling in the church, or to give prayers. And it's different depending on, it's up to the disciplinary council what it looks like exactly. But in a probationary period, they're only allowed to participate as the disciplinary council states, and then they meet with that council regularly to update them on their progress and how they're doing in the areas of their life in discussion.
Could sanctions also include excommunication?
Yes, they could.
Okay. And if someone were to faced that disciplinary council, you said they couldn't take the sacrament at church, right?
Yes,
That would
until
be
they're
one
told that it's
possibility.
okay.
Okay.
Yes.
And that would be apparent to fellow church members if that was taking place, correct?
Not the disciplinary council. A lot of members may choose not to take the sacrament 1 week,
Okay.
just for how it's viewed. It's viewed as a commitment throughout the week to remember Christ in your actions and to follow the teachings which we've been taught within the church. And so sometimes people who have felt that they have slipped up during the week or they've done something that they regret, especially if it's something larger, sometimes they will, in a way of humbling themselves, forego taking it until they have proven to themselves, until they feel worthy again to partake.
Okay. So if you slip up, so to speak, you're not supposed to take the sacrament. Is that right? Or is that more of a
Again,
personal
it's personal decision. At the same time, there are certain things like the law of chastity that you are supposed to address with your bishop if you slip up in certain areas. Law of chastity or the word of wisdom, not drinking, smoking, things like that.
Okay.
In other areas, the smaller things, it's personal discretion because the sacrament is also a commitment to say, I may have slipped up this week, but next week I will try my best to do better at those things.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, during the entire time, you knew Mr. Alexander and Miss Arias, whether they were boyfriend and girlfriend or not. Did you have any reason or were you under any impression that Jodi was, quote unquote, stalking Travis?
No, I had no impression. I heard that from people, that they would say that who didn't know her. What I saw for the most part was Jodi was confused about where they stood as their relationship. She talked to my mother and I and kind of the family. She would voice her concerns about her uncertainty about where they stood in the home with us, but she would, Travis would text, they would text each other, and she would go swing by and they would hang out. And so I heard the accusations that she was stalking, but I always kind of shrugged them off because I never saw anything in my experience to dictate that.
Would it be fair to say your impression was that Jodi loved Travis?
Yes.
Objection.
Thank you.
As I disagree. And lack of foundation.
Sustained on foundation. You may inquire further.
You spent a lot of time with Travis and Jodi together, right?
Yes.
You went on trips together.
Yes.
You spent time with Miss Arias as someone you said that was like a sister to you.
Yes.
You said she gave signs to you that she was confused about her relationship with Travis.
Yes.
Based on all those conversations and all the interaction and the interaction you saw with them together, are you under the impression that Jodi loved Travis?
Objection, lack of foundation. When?
At any point in time?
Again, same objection.
Sustained.
When they were dating and you went to have a soup pie in 2007 in the summer, based on what you observed there, do you believe Jodi loved Travis?
Based on what I observed there, I believe she I believe that she did love him, but that she was trying to figure out where they stood. And she made comments to that. I just want to know where we stand.
Objection, hearsay.
Sustained.
Was that, without telling us what she said, was that the same impression about her loving Travis but being confused that she had in the fall of 2007 when she was hanging out with you and your family discussing these things?
With regard to her feelings for Travis?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. And you also said in having those feelings, Travis would call her, text her, whatever, and she would come over to his house, right?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Looks like we have a few questions from the jury. Counsel, please approach. Mr. Freeman, the jurors have some questions for you. What is UFC Fight Night?
It's the Ultimate Fighting Championship. It's a televised cage fight, and so every time that they would have a fight, Travis would have a televised. He had a projector and a big screen and surround sound on it. He would have a big fight night, and everyone would come out and bring potluck food, chips and salsa and dip and pizza, and it was just kind of a big party, get together for everybody to hang out and talk and socialize.
Were the arguments between Travis and Jodi any different than arguments between other couples you have observed?
I didn't think so. No.
Were these normal arguments between a couple with respect to the severity and way they fought from your personal experience?
Yes.
Did you ever see Travis hit Jodi or be in any way abusive to her?
No, none whatsoever.
Aside from Jodi, were there others not included in both groups when events were held at Travis' home?
My sister on occasion, and Aaron Dewey. He was a roommate of Travis's as well. I don't know if he was there when I would hang out with Travis and Jodi, but I know that he was there when Travis would hang out with Jodi as well, because he was still a roommate in the house.
Did you ever hear Travis call Jodi names?
No.
Did you ever see Travis physically harm Jodi?
No.
Follow up, Mr. Nermi.
Thank you, Your Honor. Could you explain to us, you said you attended some of these fight nights that Mr. Alexander would host. Maybe the question makes me think, could you explain what we're talking about here? Are we talking about Olympic wrestling? What are we talking these fights entail here?
It's mixed martial arts. So boxing, wrestling, Muay Thai, any of the different styles as they're combined together. Just various conglomerate of mixed martial arts in any form.
Okay, you said that in a very dignified fashion, Mr. Freeman, but are these really brutal fights?
Yeah,
Is that what we're talking about
yes.
here? Okay, thank you.
From the state?
I don't have anything else.
Any other questions from the jury? Ladies and gentlemen, we are going to take the noon recess at this time. Please be back in the designated area at 1:25, and we will start promptly at 1:30. Please remember the admonition. Have a nice lunch.